Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off on Lecture 12, Population Viability Analysis. And what I'd like to do is go through a simple demonstration population viability analysis, hopefully to make some of these concepts even more concrete. And you can now start thinking about how you're going to run through these steps in your system. And you have all lab this week on Friday, the 3rd of April, to work with your project group and start going through these steps with your final projects. All right. So if you'd like to follow along, just click on this link. That's going to take you to an R download for an R script that goes through a simple demonstration PVA. I'll walk you through it in this video, and I'd encourage you to just sort of first follow along just along the video. Don't necessarily try to follow along in R, and then follow along in R the next time. And so just know that the script is available here. You can save it in wherever you'd like to save it and load it up in R Studio. All right. So let's move over to our studio. Hopefully you can all see the screen here. I'll make it a little bit bigger just so you can see it. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through this really simple population viability analysis and go through all the steps that we just talked about. Now, step 1 is conceptualize the life history. Oftentimes this involves figuring out how many stages you're going to use and what sort of density dependence process we're going to use. And I'll just tell you right now, in this case, we're modeling the population as a simple single stage stochastic model with density dependence. It is a simple model, and that's pretty much all we have to do for step 1 in this case. But in your case, probably it's going to be a little more complicated. And so I encourage you to draw out a life history diagram and do everything that we talked about earlier. But we're going to skip step 1 in this case and just move on to step 2, parameterizing the model. All right. So we have a few parameters. This is a single stage model, and we're going to do a discrete population growth model. So we have lambda, the discrete rate of population growth, and it's density dependent, so I'm going to say this is the maximum rate of growth, kind of like Rmax, a discrete Rmax, lambda max, is equal to 1.15. So in my population, I have decided that 1.15 is the maximum discrete rate of growth, and hopefully I got this from the literature. I need an initial population size. In this case, I am choosing 51. And again, hopefully I got that somewhere. Of course I didn't. I'm just making this stuff up, but you should not be doing that. And carrying capacity, I set at 175. Again, based on good information that I just grabbed out of my head. All right. So that's some parameters we need, but not all. Now, this is, I said, a stochastic model. So I need to figure out what the annual environmental stochasticity is. And I'm going to fit environmental stochasticity as a normal distribution in this case. And so I'm going to have to set a standard deviation on my annual growth rate, lambda. And so that is what I'm doing here. I set that at 0.11. That is the standard deviation of annual growth. And of course, I need to define the density dependence that's going on in this system. So what I'm using here is what's called, and some of you may have heard of this, especially if you have read some papers in the fisheries literature, if you're interested in fisheries biology. The Ricker model of population growth is a classic discrete logistic growth model. It is very similar to the logistic growth model that we've already looked at. It's just a little different, and it has this exp term, or e to the log transformed lambda max lambda times 1 minus the previous abundance divided by k. Now that looks similar to the logistic growth model where you have 1 minus n over k, but this is a specific form of the logistic growth model that's really commonly used, especially in fisheries. All right, so I'm using the Ricker density dependence model, and I'm going to also impose a catastrophe in this case. And a catastrophe is just an extreme example of environmental stochasticity. In this case, I'm saying that there's a flood chance of a major flood, and I'm saying there's a 5% chance of a major flood. And I also have to define what lambda is in a flood year. So in those rare years where there's a flood, what is the population growth rate? And it's probably not good. So it's going to be well under 1. And so it means that there's a decline of some sort. And I'm saying that basically the population growth in a flood year is 0.25. So that's in a way saying 25% of the population can survive a flood, assuming there's no reproduction. All right, so that's pretty much it for parameterization. And I just want to step back for 1 second and remind you that this all has to be predicated on some sort of research question that you have. Ideally for PVA, it's going to be a practical research question that has importance for deciding how to manage a species or what the future conservation outlook for a species might look like. And in this case, let's say that my main question is, I'm assuming that climate change is going to cause an increase in the severity of floods. And I want to know how severe a flood has to be in order to increase the extinction risk above a predetermined threshold level that is unacceptable, an unacceptable extinction risk. So how much would climate change have to increase the severity of floods in order to increase the extinction risk above an acceptability threshold? So that's why I'm including this catastrophe term in here and including these probability of a flood and the severity of a flood. So if I'm going to think about what scenarios I might want to run in this case, if my question's about flood severity, I'm going to want to run the model across a range of flood severities. So maybe I go from, a severity, very, very minor severity, like lambda equals 0.9. So basically, population is declining, but not that much in a flood year, all the way to maybe 0.1, which is like only 1%, only 10% of the population survive a flood, something like that. So just think about what scenarios you might want to run to answer your question. Now, step 3 is add spatial structure, and I'm going to skip over because we have not even really talked about spatial structure that much. That's the next couple lectures, so we're going to skip over that, but just know that some of you might be wanting to model spatial structure. It might be important in answering your research question. Step 4, simulate. Okay, let's simulate from this model. So before we can do that, let me just read in all these parameters into R. So I'm just going to Control Enter just to load these all up into R. So now I have this Ricker function. Note that I defined a function here called Ricker that takes, and a function, like I said before, is it's kind of a machine. It takes some input. In this case, the input is previous abundance, and it provides a result. And the result in this case is whatever the abundance will be in the next year, given this growth model. All right. So every time we call this Ricker function, you give it a previous abundance, and it'll give you a current abundance on the basis of this model. All right. I'll keep reading these in, flood probabilities, read that in. And now we can start defining the simulation parameters. We're in step 4, simulate. And I'm going to run the model for 100 years. And I'm going to run 500 replicates of 100-year model. Remember, a single trajectory of 100 years isn't going to mean anything because this is a stochastic model. And so every run is going to be different. I'm going to run 500 different runs of this 100-year model in order to make my conclusions. All right, now I'm going to write a function that basically runs the PVA. It takes a lot of input. A function is, again, it can be as complex as you want to make it, and it can take as many inputs as you want, and it can provide as many outputs as you want. But here, the inputs are the number of reps that we want to run number of replicates we want to run, the number of years we want to run each replicate for, the initial abundance of each replicate, the maximum growth rate or lambda max, carrying capacity, the probability of a flood, and the growth rate in a flood year. And within the function, every time you call this PVA function, it's going to set up its own storage array, pop array, which is going to store the abundance in every year for every replicate. And then it's going to loop through the replicates. Each time, it's going to initialize the abundance at the init n. It's going to initialize the abundance. And then it's going to loop through all the years, just like we've done in the past. And it's going to compute the next year on the basis of the previous year using this Ricker function that we defined. All right? And then, once it does that, it's going to impose a catastrophe. If, it's using an if then else, if a random number is less than the probability of a flood, so if the probability of a flood is 0.05 and I pick a random number that's 0.6, there's not a flood year. It's only a flood year if that random number is less than the probability of a flood. I could say less than or equal to but if it's less than flood prob in this case, if the random number, and I should say this RUnif1 is just drawing one random uniform distributed number from a lower bound of 0 and an upper bound of 1. So, it can take any value between 0 and 1. And if that number, that random number is less than 0.05, so if it's 0.02, then it is a flood year. And in which case, I multiply I compute what the abundance is next year by just multiplying previous year abundance by the flood lambda, the lambda in a flood year. Otherwise, nothing happens. I just use the same, I use the abundance that was computed on the basis of the Ricker function, which represents a normal year. So only in a flood year does this flood lambda term come into play. All right, and then this function returns this fully developed array of abundances for every year and for every replicate that I want to run. So that basically, this little function here performs an entire population simulation. All right. And if I want to run different scenarios, what I'd have to do is just run this function multiple times with, say, different values of what lambda is in a flood year. All right. So here we go. We can run this. Actually, I don't think I read it in. So let me read it in, and then I can run the model. And it doesn't take very long to run, which is great. I can run like thousands of simulations if I want for hundreds of years, and it won't take very long because computers are super fast. And we can run it. You can see that now I have results, right? But that's not very interesting. I need a better visualization. So the first kind of visualization that we tend to do is the spaghetti plot, where we just plot all the different trajectories and make this cloud of possible futures. And so we can visualize what the future population might look like, and we can do that. So I can write a function. You can see how programmers tend to work. You just write functions to do high-level tasks, and then you can call that function in any order that you'd like. So it's a good thing to know how to do to make functions. Plot cloud is the name of this function. It takes a bunch of simulation data and it plots a spaghetti plot. That's what it does. It goes through all the replicates here and it makes a line for every replicate, and basically that plots out the entire trajectory that you want to plot out. So I'll feed that in and I will make this plot, and check that plot out. There you can zoom into it and see, man, what do you see in that? Really not much. That is not a very useful plot. So the point here is that spaghetti plots aren't the be-all and end-all or be-all. I think I've been saying that wrong. And there are other, sometimes better visualizations to do than the spaghetti plot. This is a very useless spaghetti plot. Because there's so much variability here. The catastrophe is such an important aspect of this model, and it can happen at any year. So in any given trajectory, it's totally random. It can happen anywhere, and the population goes down, and it starts going back up, and it might go down again. And it's basically all over the map, and it really doesn't tell you much to look at this. So let's look at some alternative visualizations here. First of all, one thing we might want to do is visualize the extinction risk or extinction rates over time. And I can make a function that takes the simulation data, computes the extinction risk, and we can then plot out the extinction risk by time. And we can see in this case that here's this dark line is indicating the extinction risk. It starts off, within the first 10 years or so, there's no risk of extinction. But by year 20, there's this pretty small risk of extinction. We can impose a threshold and say 0.05 is a common threshold that's unacceptable extinction risk above 0.05. And we can see that under this scenario, by year 38 or so, you rise above an unacceptable risk threshold. All right. So that tells us something. It can be a really useful way to visualize the results of your simulation, and it's something that anybody could understand. Extinction risk as a function of time that the model is run. All right. Let's look at another one. Let's look at the final abundance. Sometimes we're really interested in what the final abundance is likely to be. And so we can easily just plot out the final abundance even as just a histogram. Here's the hist function, which just is R's way of plotting out a histogram. We can add some graphical parameters like in labels to the x-axis and a label to the y-axis. And we can add, this would add a main title to the graph, but I just didn't include any main title. Let's plot out the histogram. Here we go. So final abundance after 100 years, this is a histogram of the abundance. Sometimes after 100 years, the abundance is well above 100, 150, almost 200. Sometimes it's down close to 0. So again, there's a lot of variability here, but this is kind of informative. And I could even add some kind of threshold abundance below which we do not want to see the population go. In this case, we might not want the population to go below 50. Well, we see there's pretty good chance here the population will be below 50 after 100 years. A lot of these simulation runs ended up below 50 individuals after 100 years, and that's not good if that is our threshold. It's not good pretty much in any case. Like, you don't want populations that small. All right. Another kind of useful way to visualize the results from a PVA model is to plot out across a range of possible declines, what's the probability of declining that much? All right. So I can say, let's see, what's the probability of us not declining at all? 0, all the way to what's the probability of declining from 100 down to 0. And I can just compute the probability of each of those declines just by running this quick for loop across all these different possible declines and just computing the number of simulation runs or the percent of simulation runs that fell below that threshold. Let's look at this plot and we can talk a little bit about it. There we go. All right, so this is a little bit harder to interpret, but it's actually kind of useful, especially if you are presenting the results of simulation to managers, because you don't necessarily want to impose a threshold below which the manager should care. The manager different people might have different thresholds that they care about, different decline thresholds. This kind of figure doesn't impose that. You don't impose that on the managers. You don't say you should care about a decline of 40% or a 80% decline, or you should care about 100% decline. You don't impose that, and you let the manager decide. So maybe some manager might say, okay, a 25% decline is really important. I care. That person cares about a 25% decline. Well, you can say, well, the probability of a 25% decline is around 50%. You can just look it up. There's a 20% decline, and there it's about 50% or a little more. So it's kind of a useful way to present the results. And you could, if you want, plot a threshold on there and say, okay, 25% decline is about just over 50% probability. But again, you could pick any threshold and determine the decline. And I should just go back real quick and say I misinterpreted what that decline was. In this case, the decline is a percent decline. So we're going all the way from a 0% decline all the way to a 100% decline, meaning extinction. All right. And finally, let's get to that scenario test idea and answer a question. And the question again is, let's assume climate change may influence the severity of floods and increase the severity of floods. Now, let's try to identify what severity of floods, right? We can run different flood severity scenarios. We're going to run a whole sequence of scenarios going from lambda during a flood year of 0.9, which is not very severe. It's a pretty minor decline, all the way to 0.1, or a major decline, basically only 1% survival. And we'll just make a whole sequence, and you can see what happens when you do this. You get a whole sequence going from 0.9 all the way to 0.1 in increments of 0.05. So there we go. There's a bunch of scenarios that we can test, and we can use our PVA function to run the PVA for each of these scenarios. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a for loop, and I'm going to loop through all these scenarios, and each time for each scenario I'm going to run this PVA demo function, which is going to run 100 replicates, or whatever replicate I say. We get 500 replicates of 100 years, and it's going to use whatever. It's going to loop through all the scenarios. So it's going to run the model for every one of these flood lambdas, which is represented by this whole sequence here. There we go. And we're going to store the results for all the scenarios in another storage vector, and we can plot that out, and that will be a very high impact figure, and then we can really inform the questions that we went into this wanting to get some information on. So here we go. Let's run it. We're going to run this for loop. I forgot to read in that function. Here we go. So it only takes a couple minutes to run a whole bunch of scenarios, or less than a minute, to run all these scenarios. And we can plot out on the x-axis, we have the impact of the flood. So at the lower end here, you have really high impact floods, only 20% survival or only 10% survival. And at the high end, you have pretty low impact floods. And you can see that there's kind of a threshold here. Any flood or scenario where the flood severity is less than around, the lambda during a flood year is less than 0.4. The survival in a flood is less than 40%. You see that the extinction risk starts going up. And if you maybe compute or you specify a threshold here where anything above that is unacceptable, any extinction risk above that is unacceptable, then we can actually answer our question and say, okay, if climate change causes flood severity to go below 0.4, causes the survival in a flood year to go below 0.4, then extinction risk goes up above a predetermined acceptability threshold. And so that answers our question. And that's just an example of using scenario testing to answer a question. All right, and that's pretty much what I wanted to go through in this demonstration. I would encourage you to go through the R code, but mostly I just want to make sure that you know the steps that are involved in putting a PVA together. And I hope you take this as a chance to think through how you're going to do your own PVA and how you're going to run your own scenario tests. And I look forward to working with all of you on doing that. And I'll see you next time.